Yeah, so we're very pleased to see all of you here. I think we're about 15 different nationalities, and it's great to have so many, at the same time, government experts here, but also people from academia and the private sector. What I'll try to do for the next 15 or 20 minutes is just to give an introduction of the topic, to say a little bit more why we're interested in that topic at the ITF, and also what we'll try to achieve during this 1 day and a half. So the purpose of the roundtable is really to bring you experts together to discuss the ways how governments support connectivity for remote and sparsely populated areas. But also part of this will be to discuss criteria that underpin this support. And finally, we're quite ambitious, but we really want to come up with some best practice and recommendations also on how to improve policies that are in place, and to see what's important in designing effective support schemes for these communities. As an outcome of this roundtable, we want to publish a report that will write up after this event, and which will include 4 different discussion papers. You've already received 3 of them. This next slide is actually just to see a little bit what the share of population is in remote communities. And for this, I just wanted to see if you could raise your hand if you know in your country what is the share of people living in remote communities. So, okay, very few of you actually know the share of population. It's also quite hard to compare because countries have so many different definitions and classifications in their statistical system. Well, you have a few countries that are really at the top, where about 1/4 of the population lives in predominantly rural, remote areas, as the OECD calls it. So that's according to the OECD regional classification. But at the lower end, you have, of course, countries like the UK or Spain or Belgium, who have a percentage of less than 2%. And of course, there are other countries I didn't include here because they don't have any significant share of remote communities. So we're talking about transport in remote areas because these areas often face a different set of economic challenges, some of which are linked to remoteness, and I guess James will recognize these because he's one of the few people who has worked on these challenges. Of course, the absence of agglomeration benefits that you usually find in urban areas, the high transport costs, sometimes often combined also with the structural weakness in the local economy, reliance on a single economic sector sometimes, small local markets where competition can be restricted, on average also higher unemployment. But I have to say that it's quite hard even to, I would have liked to put up some numbers, for example, unemployment, but even at the OECD, much work is focused on urban areas, and often we don't find the numbers that are broken down into rural areas that are close to cities and rural areas that are more remote. However, I found some numbers which show that the proximity to cities makes really a difference for some rural areas. Actually, you can see that in terms of productivity, there seems to be a narrowing gap in general for rural communities that are closer to cities. But that's unfortunately not the case for rural remote areas. These numbers are just for the EU. I couldn't find any numbers that that included more countries, but I think that's already quite illustrative that these regions are lagging in terms of productivity and output. Of course, transport could be one means to really mitigate these problems and to overcome this geographic distance. But of course, there are a lot of challenges to that. As you've seen already in the papers that were written for this event, many countries, they face problems with their lifeline connections. They're often not resilient enough. For example, if there is a disruption, there's just no alternative route for people. Then public transport links are often very infrequent or even non-existent in many countries or in these areas specifically. And prices for transport can be very high and can be really an obstacle to mobility for people. Finally, is also a question of environmental efficiency of this long-distance travel. And if we want to talk about decarbonization, it really is hard to look at these areas with that in mind. There are other context-specific challenges, for example, the seasonality of traffic in some areas, either because of tourism or climatic conditions that restrict access, for example, in winter, or as Deputy Minister Keenan already said, the climate change issues that some communities really face and that really change their ways they deal with transport, or even makes them change transport modes because one mode is not longer viable. We see that in many remote areas, you really have a problem that markets alone cannot provide the connectivity that's needed. And of course, there's lower demand in sparsely populated areas, which means that the cost for transport per passenger is obviously quite high. And this lack of economies of scale makes it also very unpopular for private operators who don't have any incentives to operate on these routes. That, of course, justifies that countries support these regions. And in our paper that you should have received, we try to give a few examples of these policies, and we try to break them down in different categories. We found a lot of diverse measures how to support these regions. That could be a direct subsidy, could be a tax expenditure, support even to loss-making state-run services, or transfer of risk to government, for example, in preferential loans, but also shadow subsidies with an opportunity cost, I call them, because there might be protected slots at airports for thin domestic routes, for example. All of this also begs the question, which and how much public support is needed, of course, and that's really going into the questions that we want to discuss during this 1.5 days. For example, how do countries establish the optimal level of connectivity or accessibility for remote communities? And second, how should we design effective connectivity support measures? And is there actually a best practice for doing this, or does this really just depend on the country context, etc.? First, if you want to define what's optimal in terms of connectivity for your country or for this region, that really depends on the objectives you have in terms of social development, in terms of economic development, and there are really a range of rationales, different rationales that we saw when connecting these communities. And the social and economic arguments are quite obvious, but you also find strategic arguments, for example, in border regions that are quite badly connected to the economic centers. Countries, for strategic reasons, want to avoid losing population there, and then therefore support transport to these regions. Then knowing what's optimal may also depend on whether we know the benefits that a certain scheme can provide in reaching the economic and social goals that we have. And that's quite important for appraisal that we'll also talk about. The problem is that it's very hard to know which economic benefits we can expect from a certain intervention in transport. And there may be other social benefits, of course, that are not considered or are also just very hard to measure. Then I already alluded to that, it's sometimes hard to know what's remote or what's isolated, and there are very different definitions that exist even in one jurisdiction. You can have two different ways of calculating what is remote, but we think that it's really important to know that we see how well connected or how remote certain communities are, because without precise knowledge of connectivity levels, there's also no basis for underpinning or justifying support. In the paper, we included some definitions that countries use, and we find that they don't all reflect remoteness necessarily. Some are based on geographical distance, it's just purely geographical. Some are really dependent on driving time. Some are based on access to population centers, some access to services, for example, in Norway. And some are really much more refined. What we could see in Chile, that they really put up an index of isolation, and they really include also the economic and social factors that play into that. And finally, we'll also need to know the thresholds that we set. If we go beyond a cost-benefit analysis approach, which obviously doesn't really work in these regions, we also need to determine whether we want to base it on equity, on equal opportunities, or we want to base it on a minimum access threshold, or if we might want to consider what is actually socially necessary, what level of transport we provide there. For example, you also need to find what are basic and other important services, how often and how much time should I be able to access these, for example. Do I even have a right to a minimum access level, and so on. Then some other questions that I think will be important for this roundtable will also be whether there is really a best practice in designing the different schemes, and that includes questions how to monitor these schemes, how to see whether they can be stable over time but still flexible, and whether you can integrate changes. What about, for example, local ownership? Should local authorities be required to co-fund projects to avoid overbidding, or even regional lobbying for support to make it less of a political issue, finally, to grant support to these areas in terms of transport? And should these transport policies also be integrated with other regional initiatives? For example, with economic policy, where you combine it with reducing corporate tax rates in some areas, or if you coordinate it with certain health and education policies. So all of these questions we want to look at in light of the different case studies that will be presented. And this will work in a way that we always have one presenter who will be recorded, and at the same time a discussant who will ask some specific questions also on this case study, but then we'll really try to broaden the questions and the discussion so that all of you also have the opportunity to compare with what you have seen in your countries and the experience you've made. So with that, I'm giving the microphone back to Gunnar. Thanks.